Thanks a lot for coming. I think choosing between 18 sessions and being here is such a pleasure. So thank you very much for being here. My name is Edu. I'm a CSA farmer based in the Netherlands. I'm a member of the ECVC, which is the European coordination of Via Campesina. And I'm super happy to be holding up this session with friends from Via Campesina, friend from Land Workers Alliance, and Carson, a farmer and indigenous person from Kenya. And we're going to be talking today about land reforms and why it's not outdated. I hope when you read this title, it was a bit catchy, like, is it outdated or not? That's the things we're going to be trying to discuss, depending on which territories are we talking about. But before going into the topic, before introducing the speakers, and before going into the whole schedule of the session, with Via Campesina, sometimes we try to start sessions with a mystica, which is it's just a moment to ground, it's just a moment to reflect on the topic. And because today the session, it's also like live streaming, there's some friends online. I'm going to be asking you a question, and I will ask you to either like talk to your neighbor about this question, or if you're alone at your house in front of the laptop, think about yourself and reflect on this question. So the question is, how do you relate with land and soil where you are currently living? And please try to think beyond farming, try to think beyond the ownership of land, and try to think about the social aspect and the spiritual deep connection you might have with land and soil where you're currently living. Talk to your neighbor. I give you a minute, we break the ice, and then we start a session. I will have it here. Something. Okay. Thank you. I would love to keep you longer discussion, but we can start a session. Thank you. It was a bit difficult for me to interrupt you. But no worries, because we're really planning this session in an interactive way. So we're going to have some questions for the speakers, which is going to be half of the session. And the other half of the session, it's going to be for all of us together to ask them questions. I want to start this session by reading how we put the description. So we titled with a friend from Via Campesina, Why Agrarian Reform is Not Outdated. We said land grabbing isn't just a phenomenon that takes place in the global south. Is it very much a reality in Europe? The land prices are growing. Companies from outside the agriculture sector are investing in land, and energy production as well as carbon offsetting schemes are competing with food production. Young people and new entrants struggle to access land, while farmers approaching retirement are structurally obliged to shut up shop. Frustrating, the UK government remains committed to investing in the capitalist global land agenda. But other countries are joining with civil society to call for a new multilateral international conference on agrarian reform and rural development, the ICARRD, we're going to talk about it later, to take place soon and to be organized by the FAO in 2026. It's time to reopen the discussion of what agrarian reform could also mean in the UK and European context and outside European context. This session aims to look into the successful examples of agrarian reforms programs and to develop ideas on demands for the run-up to the new ICARRD. So as I said, this session aims to actually live with some positiveness on what an agrarian reform, successful agrarian reform looks like. And for this, we want to say that we have three amazing speakers coming from totally three different territories, and we need to be aware what we understand as a land reform or agrarian reform might be something completely different, depending on which territories and location of the world we're talking about. And I would like to start with Anuka, but first I was forgetting something. The structure of this session is going to be the follow. We are going to have a question for the speakers. After this question, we're going to have a very, very quick remark or clarification from the audience, but only one to give them a break. Yeah? We're going to have a second round of questions, and then we're going to have the Q&A with you. So I will ask you, please, if you have any question during their interventions, please note it down, and then we will have the interaction afterwards. Hope it's clear. And I'm going to run to the first question to you, all of you, and Anuka is going to start. The first question is why an agrarian reform in your territories nowadays is something important. And please, if you can share some successful stories from Sri Lanka and India.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm Anuka de Silva from Sri Lanka. I'm part of the International Coordination Committee of La Via Campesina, and also I'm part of the agrarian settlements also. My agrarian settlement is starting in the 1968 under the big water reserve. That's how I become a farmer. My grandparents, my father, as a third generation, I'm also doing farming. That's why I really want to be part of the agrarian reform. Is not outdated. It's really important as a young people, especially young women, who part of the food producing. In Sri Lanka, we have a kind of left route in the 60s. That's how we have a kind of different agrarian reform in Sri Lanka. Because 60s, we're starting with the agrarian reform with kind of different perspective. I saw it's like a kind of good and bad perspective in the agrarian reform, because everyone knows how it's like a green revolution start with the 60s. It's very much connected with the Sri Lankan agrarian reform. Because starting point of the 60s, we have a good agrarian reform, but we need to identify what kind of problem inside of the agrarian reform. Because as my grandparents, they belongs to the fishing community. And the government starting to giving the lands for the different communities, but with the Sri Lankan context, it's like a majority Sinhala, like a ethnic diversity with that agrarian reform. My village, now we have 33,000 families under this agrarian reform. We didn't have any other ethnic groups. No Christians, no Tamil, no Islam. That's how it's happening in Sri Lankan agrarian reform in that sense. But anyway, as a fishing community, we didn't have a land in that sense. We are part of the food producing as a fishing community, but we didn't have a land to access. Because in the season, we cannot have access to the food as a fishing community. That's why we are getting land, my grandparents getting land in the agrarian settlement. We saw that how it's like a political way to go with the agrarian reform through the giving land for the majority. That's happening all over the world. They are choosing what they need as a political manner. Second point, I really want to say how it's like a green revolution happened with the agrarian reform in Sri Lanka. Because starting with the 60, we have a different kind of agrarian reforms. My grandfather getting kind of seeds from the hybrid seeds from the government, and also they get the fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, through the starting their farming, because they are not farmers. They are not farmers. They are starting new farming method with that agrarian reform. It's happened to Sri Lanka. It's how very linked with the global political new imperialism through the agrarian reform in Sri Lanka. But anyway, we got the lands. And also I have a kind of, say, good way. We have Agrarian Reform Act in the 1972. We have a kind of ceiling, because under the British, we have a huge tea plantation in Sri Lanka. We are producing Ceylon tea as a brand. In that sense, but government is starting to have a ceiling. In Sri Lanka, we have a kind of ceiling, kind of 100 acres. Over 100 acres, we cannot have a private ownership. We have a good land distribution. It's like a government is starting a state agriculture corporation through the tea plantation. Yes, but in the same way, it's not the access to the land to the workers who coming in as Indian descendants, who working in the tea plantation. They are not part of the access to the land. Still, 200 years, they are living in very bad condition. They didn't have any basic needs, like no housing, no sanitary. Still, it's happening in Sri Lanka. Anyway, it's under the government. But in the same way, with the new way, we are in the huge economic crisis. That sense, we are looking for the new kind of agrarian reform coming through the new neoliberal mechanism. Because this land reform under the government in the 1972, we cannot access land as a private ownership. It's under the government. My land belongs to the government as a 99 years lease. We cannot sell or rent it for others. But now, with the economic crisis, new way of land grabbing is happening, trying to happen. With the IMF condition, International Monetary Fund, they put some condition to the land. They're saying, yes, we need to give land ownership, private ownership for the farmers, because it's easy to. They can sell out, they can rent. That is the way new kind of land market it's going to open. That's why we are thinking how we really thinking real agrarian reform. That's way Lavia Campesina trying to start new dialogue, because we see how it's like an international land coalition going to start with the land tenure, and they're going to start new process. How World Bank playing role through the new agrarian reform, naming agrarian reform kind of new new methods to get the people's land. We are very much concerning as thinking about the agrarian reform. It's how we giving land for the who produce the food. That is our main idea as Lavia Campesina. Because as a Sri Lankan experience, we have a kind of good and bad experience. And South Asia, I really like to say, is India. We have a huge gap between the class and caste, because a lot of land belongs to the farmers, but same way, they are landlords. They don't allow to have a agrarian reform in that sense, because of the caste controlling the all political background in India as a South Asia. We need to rethink how we go beyond that kind of politics through the agrarian reform. That's I want to say in the first round. Thank you.
I know the question, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Tara Wight from the Land Workers Alliance in Scotland. So coming from a really different context, that was really interesting, thank you. Yeah, the idea of there not being private land ownership of agricultural land is really interesting when you're coming from a Scottish context where we have the most concentrated land ownership in Europe, I think the second most concentrated in the world, and just sort of 400 and something people owning more than half the country, including a huge amount of agricultural land. So we have this really unregulated land market, basically a kind of free-for-all. And yeah, the reason that we've kind of ended up in this situation in Scotland is there's a whole range of different reasons. One of the reasons being that we didn't have a government until the late 90s for several centuries. So the people making the decisions and the laws about land were the landowners. And yeah, a history of really brutal clearances over the past few centuries that have led to a huge amount of disconnect between people and land. You know, where it's a very urban country in that most of the population live in the urban centres and have very little connection to the land, or little access to land. Land reform is, so yeah, I think it's interesting as well, we were just talking about this before, that the term agrarian reform is used so much in the kind of international context. We don't actually use that term much at all in Scotland. We talk about land reform, but that's, I don't know, maybe if we talked about agrarian reform more, we'd make the connection to food and farming a bit stronger. I'm not sure. Since the Scottish Government, the devolved Scottish Government formed, we've had 3 different land reform bills. The third of those is going through Parliament at the moment. But during that time, the concentration of land ownership has only got worse. So clearly these land reform bills, although it's very much on the political agenda, it's talked about a lot by the SNP government, it isn't leading to what I would consider to be, you know, meaningful land reform. Yeah, you wanted some kind of positive examples of things. We did have a community right to buy introduced in Scotland, which has resulted in some really positive things. That means that communities of geography, so yeah, a community in a particular geographical area can have a kind of, the sort of first right to buy land when it comes up for sale, and there's some government support to help communities to buy that land. And since that came in, we have seen a shift to, I think, 3% of the land in Scotland is now owned by communities. So that is really great. That's a positive thing. It hasn't, 3% is not very much in a country where more than half the land is owned by 400 and something people. Some of the biggest benefits, I would say, in terms of the community right to buy have been in the crofting areas. I'm not going to go into loads of detail about crofting. There's a session on that tomorrow morning. But yeah, this is a particular form of land tenure that we have in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And some of the community buyouts in the crofting areas have, there's a lot of crofting happening on that community-owned land. In some of the other areas, the community right to buy is often not being used for farmland, so it doesn't really have that much to do with food production. And it would be it's difficult, for example, for a group who want to start a cooperative farm. They don't have access to that community right to buy because it has to be a community of place rather than a community of interest. The land reform generally the kind of agenda hasn't focused at all really on making land available for farming. And we have this really aging population of farmers. So there's a succession crisis, and it's very difficult for new entrants to access land. But yeah, one of the key issues is that there just isn't this focus on redistribution of land when the government is talking about land reform in a Scottish context. The key issue, the reason land is so inaccessible, particularly in the Scottish context where there's a completely unregulated market, is just that the price is too high. The price of land is now stopping communities from being able to access their community right to buy. They just simply cannot get the money together to afford it, even though they have that right. It's definitely stopping people getting into farming. And the price is being driven up, I think it was mentioned a bit in the introduction, by carbon markets, natural capital. Often it's not even actually kind of carbon offsetting schemes, it's just sort of speculation. The land might be worth more in future because of the potential for that. So it's not that we're seeing loads of tree planting, although there's some. It's just that is driving up the price of land, and land is just a good investment for corporations, basically. So yeah, that's the kind of context in Scotland. So I think we really desperately need land reform, especially from a food sovereignty, food security perspective. We import a huge amount of our food, and there's going to be less and less food production in Scotland unless we see redistribution of land and a new generation of farmers. But the direction that the government is taking land reform at the moment isn't really addressing that at all, or and looking at redistribution.
Should I repeat the question? Sorry. So the question, Carson, that we're asking as a first round is, in your local context, we started with Sri Lanka, we went to Scotland, and now in Kenya. And you can, if you don't mind, to introduce a little bit about your community in the north of Kenya, why an agrarian reform at the national level, but also in the local context, it's important. And if you have any successful cases or successful examples in Kenya or anything else you know in that context. Thank you.
Thank you, Edu. I hope I'm audible enough. It's been a long journey coming all the way here, from 28 degrees centigrade to 30 degrees. So I am a pastoralist in the broad sense, but I should also add and say that my people have practiced a new form of farming over the last, 40 years. What we would call agropastoralism. We live like 100 kilometers north of equator. My tribe is called Endorize, and it would be interesting if we had time. I would tell you the history of why agrarian reform is something that is important in mentioning that there's a link between what has happened in the past and what is happening right now, and why the issue of climate change actions or action, politically speaking, is also hampering the efforts to tackle climate change. But having said that, cattle is the centerpiece of my food sovereignty, representing now the people that I speak for, and dipping into cultural preservation and transmission. The reason why I mentioned cattle is that even last evening when we were with these friends here, they were asking me, what are you having? I'm a vegetarian. My friend was saying, I'm a vegetarian. And I was like, no, I'm a meat person. So, I mean, I am unapologetic for that, because that is who I am, and it's my food heritage. So I have slowly stepped into advocacy on indigenous rights, themed on those components that I have mentioned, but of course intricately linked into land. Our agrarian structure is both smallholder and community-owned, not just for my people, now speaking nationally, based on the laws of the land. Smallholder farming has a massive support of the government and other global, quote-unquote, global stakeholders. Obviously, you have the same challenges that we do. My friend Edward Brooks, who spoke here in the morning, was telling me the same issue, and also Tara here besides me, who is seated here with me, has also told me about the same challenge in Scotland. But we're not complaining. We are here to say what is working and what is not working. Another issue that I should mention is that Community Land Act 2016 was a huge step in Kenya in realizing moving away from those structures that have held pastoralists or every smallholder farmer back for several years or 60 years after the hand of colonialism, even though it is important to mention those challenges that have always been there, because the government is always pro-globalists. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just saying because it's what it is, and it is enticing for the government to support large farmers for their own reasons that they know, but we do not know, because no need to give you the reason, but I should give you what is happening. What has happened is that over the last, I am past 35 years, and I don't look like that. But over those few years that I've been on Earth, there were few cases of cancer or food-related or nutritional-related diseases in my land, and generally maybe say all over Kenya, those few, 3 decades ago. But right now, almost every family has a cancer patient, or somebody who's struggling with weight or high blood pressure, things that you can easily pinpoint to the food or shift from our food systems. And that's the reason why when I began, I started by mentioning that food sovereignty is like the centerpiece of a cultural preservation and transmission to the next generation. But if we have these challenges that I just mentioned, how do we move to the next, how do we move and have hope that our identity as a people will still be surviving? I know my time is up, but I have like maybe 1 minute to add a few points. How do we address these issues? These pertinent issues, the challenges that every rural person has, and most of us here have the same challenge. Challenges to do with conservation agenda, probably it's not big here, or what one of my best authors would call conservation lie, the mining, energy, mega projects that are being forced down to us without free, prior, and informed consent, or what you would say sufficient public participation. Well, I think if everyone who is seated here and everyone who cares to listen and wants to see change in the society and reduction of all those challenges that I've mentioned, or the ones that you also know and you have come here thinking, how do we move from where we are, is that we need to alleviate rural poverty through agrarian reforms. And we've talked about these issues in CFS, for United Nations Committee on World Food Security, negotiating with our LVC friends and other farmers. But we do have land conflicts. As you may have seen in the news globally about the pastoralists in northern Tanzania, Ngorongoro and Loliondo. Those challenges forced dispossession of land so that you can save this person you're calling backward, and it's a savage. Like, we don't want, like the government of Tanzania, I am not ashamed to say this, and I'm not afraid to say this. What they are doing happened to the age of my grandfather 50 years ago, when they dispossessed us of our lake Bogoria, which is the home of our spirituality and ancestry, and other things that I wouldn't mention here. So land conflicts, like the one that you see in Ngorongoro, Tanzania, that people coming out of other places for some reason to dispossess another I should say, another human being from their food system because of chasing the dollar. And so how do we, the question that always is very difficult, as I saw in the morning with the first set of speakers here, is that the biggest question is the big multinationals, and for some reason they have a sway and power in implementing policies within our lands. I could go on and on and on and on, but I do have a question when we come back on climate change, carbon credit, and the issue of conservation. Thank you, Edu.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was like just an introduction to understand how everyone of the speakers relates to their territories and agrarian reforms. Any clarification from the audience, any quick question at this point, or something that you would like at the next round them to go a bit deeper? Yeah, okay, they're bringing a mic to you. Same for those following online, you can put the questions and we will try to read them later on. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much for all of your presentations and sharing your wisdom. I guess it's for all of the speakers. I didn't get the name of the Kenyan speaker, but maybe you specifically, it would be wonderful to go into a bit more detail about some of the things that are happening in the Kenyan context in relation to carbon offsetting. So I'm a researcher and I'm doing a PhD at the Royal Veterinary College, and last year moved across England and Wales to several agricultural shows. And one of the biggest things that's happening up in Cumbria is large landowning estates are profiting off of some of the greening schemes, and there are concerns that a lot of those greening measures, they are displacing tenant farmers as a result. And there's a challenge there around how we're balancing food production, and this is particularly in relation to upland sheep grazing farmers and tenant farmers. And in the name of greening, what are some of the unintended consequences? So I would just love to hear if you're seeing some of this in your own countries, and yeah, if you could flesh it out a bit more, please.
Thank you. That's fantastic you're asking these questions, because on relation with climate cows, carbon credits, carbon offsetting, even biodiversity credits, that's a discussion we were talking before, something that's stopping to talk about land reforms in many places of the world. How does it sound if we go to this next question and you include a response to the person on this? Sounds good? Yeah, because there's 3 different contexts. I think it's 3 slightly different answers, so we try to include on this. And as a reminder, we will have this second round of questions, so keep the questions for yourself, and then we will go to the Q&A. So this is just to go a bit more specific, and I will start with you, Anuka. Is that okay? I will start with you. So in the case of Sri Lanka, what is necessary to achieve this, we call it the second wave of agrarian reform, or like a more fair agrarian reform where like the lower caste or the workers are actually represented and also have access to land? What do we need in this local context? And because I know that you've been very much involved with the ICARRD, can you explain to the audience what is ICARRD and why it's really important to talk about land reforms towards January 2026, where in Colombia we have the ICARRD plus 20? Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. I think as a third generation of the agrarian reform, we are really concerned about the new agrarian reform in the Sri Lankan context. And what she mentioned, especially with we have a kind of conflict between the climate financing and greenwashing with the new agrarian reform, because it's coming with the context of the climate financing. It's getting worse in the sense of our territory, especially in Sri Lanka. We have a huge economic crisis. After that, so many funds coming through naming the climate financing. Now they're trying to have a new kind of wave with the climate financing, because in Sri Lankan land reform, they cannot access, like big companies cannot access to the big land because we have a kind of ceiling. That's why they're starting new project with the climate finance. They're trying to work with the farmers, naming agroforestry also. It's coming new projects. They're trying to start the new conservation. It's conservation become a very huge problematic sense in the South Asian region. Not only the Sri Lanka, it's a whole region, because they're starting conservation, naming of the green climate financing, because it's normally as an indigenous people, as a farmers, as a pastoralist, as a fishing community for fishing, they access to their own territories as a resource, like a small forest But now with under the conservation as a kind of the new project, they're putting their own territory. It's normally we access to go inside collecting the bee honeys and things. Now they make not allowed for the communities. That's very hard problem to us, because sense of the agrarian reform, it's not just land reforms. It's kind of the how to access to the whole resources. That's why we are looking for the resource access. It's the kind of in between the land reform and the agrarian reform. How we access to the water, how we access to the mangroves, because as a fishing community, they need to save their own mangroves. But in the Thailand and the Bangladesh as a Lavia, we are fighting against that kind of new project, naming the conservation, because they're cutting all mangroves, they're starting new kind of eucalyptus kind of trees. We have that experience in our mountains. They cut the trees, it's the forestry trees, they're starting new teak, eucalyptus kind of trees as a naming of the conservation. That's why we are very concerned that. And also, that's why we are looking for new kind of agrarian reform. We're saying we are not demanding for the land, only the lands. We are demanding, we need our grasslands, because we need to raise our cattle. We need to save our mangroves, because it's the breeding place for our fishers. And also, as a young people, under the laws, because it's very serious to get the new lands. Because in Sri Lanka, we have a bad experience with after war. After civil war, 2009, and Sri Lankan government started the agrarian reform through the giving same way to the majority people to the access to the minority lands. Until some people who living in the north and east, they are living in the shuttles, and the new people going to access to the land. That also we are saying we cannot say it's real way to the agrarian reform. We are demanding, as a name of the agrarian reform, we need to access the resources. It's just not only the giving land. And also we are same way, we are saying we are against that kind of conservation, because it's not the real conservation. We need to community conservation. It's not the government saying it's prohibited to access. We against that kind of conservation. And the third way, it's not only the thinking about the peasantry or pastoralists. We're thinking as an island. We are looking for the real reform with the fishing community, because new ports, new cities, kind of things coming with the new development. We against that kind of work. That's why we are saying we need real agrarian reform through the connect with the community. We need to real good policies to connect with the people who make the decision, because it's with the new waves coming with the kind of new agrarian reform through naming. It's not the real understanding to the community what they are doing. That I want to say. We are looking for the agrarian reform, especially in the Thailand, India. We have a huge issue with the climate financing, greenwashing. And India also have a huge problem with the caste. We are looking for the new land reforms through the giving deeds through the community who cannot access to the land. Yeah, I want to say like that. And the ICARRD. Yeah, I think first ICARRD happening in the Brazil in 2006. Now Lavia pushing to the FAO to bring new ICARRD. It's because of we have a kind of progressive government, very closely work with the Lavia in Colombia. They took the decision to bring to the General Assembly of UN in the International Conference on the Agrarian Reform and Rural Development. We are trying to work on it as a Lavia and also the close allies with others. And also we are looking for the progressive government to help to the ICARRD, because it's FAO didn't have a money to put that, and we are looking for how we move forward with the real sense of the agrarian reform to bring the ICARRD to be possible in the sense of the 2026 January. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. If there's any other question about the ICARRD, maybe we can keep it for later. Tara, I want to ask you the same question, and I'm adding a couple of things if you don't mind. So, same question. What do you need in the Scottish context in order to have possible land reform or agrarian reform? And you were talking about two things that are already happening, like community right to buy, and that's 3%. So I want to ask you if you think that's a tool to push forward, because you were also talking about who has access to this land. We're talking about white upper class people. So if we can develop about this, if it's a tool or not for a land reform.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to have these kind of like international knowledge sharing, because like you were asking, Anuka, about the kind of like the new wave of agrarian reform. I think it's safe to say that we never had a first wave of that in the UK at all. In the 20th century, when so much of the world went through a phase of agrarian reform or land reform, that just didn't happen here. And yeah, I think that was something I really didn't know much about until I was speaking to colleagues from La Via Campesina around the world. And I think in the Scottish context, I mean, I touched on it already, but yeah, one of the key things that we need to see is some form of market regulation. Land is just kind of traded to the highest bidder. It's very much a commodity in a Scottish context. And it's actually, it's really weird how little regulation we have compared to other places in Europe. It's not, so it's a particularly extreme situation in terms of the lack of regulation of sale of land in a Scottish context. The new land reform bill, there was at one point some talk about bringing in a public interest test on sales of very large bits of land, which might have started, that would have been the start of some regulation, where, a very large bit of land could only be sold to someone who's going to use it in the public interest. And if not, it would have to be split up. The government have ditched that proposal, even though 75% of the public were on board with it in the consultation. So the kind of legislation we're seeing at the moment really isn't going to bring about any meaningful market regulation. I think there's a lot that could be done with taxation. Obviously, there's been a lot of drama recently about the inheritance tax, which I think can safely say is a very unprogressive way of bringing about using taxation to bring about land reform, in that it, without any kind of other policies to make sure that there is a redistribution of land. That policy was just about raising revenue for the government rather than about actually meaningfully redistributing land. But there are a lot of ways that tax could be used. So I think that's something that we really do need to see. And also, I mean, even just any kind of legal mechanism to remove land from people who own too much of it and redistribute it. Something like a maximum threshold on the amount of land that one person can own, unless they can show that it's really beneficial to the public for them to own more than that. Something like that. There's been discussion about something like that being brought in. But basically, any change that kind of brings us in a direction of redistributing land to some extent or regulating the market would be helpful. With the Land Workers Alliance, we are engaging with the land reform bill that's going through Parliament, but it's really uninspiring. It's very hard to see how it's going to have any impact at all in practice. So yeah, and then there's also, I'm just going to talk very briefly about agricultural subsidies. I feel like we should talk about this all the time, and yeah, not everybody agrees with that. It's not everybody's favorite, most exciting topic. But in Scotland, we still have an area-based payment system for agricultural subsidies. So it was interesting, the point about the environmental payments being used as a reason to turn hill farmers off the land in Cumbria. We don't really have the kind of elms that's coming in England, we don't really have an equivalent system to that in Scotland. The payment system is going to remain very much a payment for owning a large amount of land, a per hectare payment for owning a large amount of land, which also results in tenants losing their land. I've spoken to a lot of tenant farmers who lost land because the farmer could make more money just by owning the land and getting the area-based payments themselves than they could make by getting the rent, so they just turf the tenants off. So it still has issues, but it's less of the kind of greenwashing related issue, but it's still connected to the payment system. In terms of the kind of carbon and land and that kind of thing, it's less connected in the way it might be to environmental payments in England, and more just to the price of land and the way in which those kind of new sort of speculative markets are driving up the price of land, making it inaccessible. And also the kind of the rewilding movement is a kind of quite a big thing in Scotland. So a lot of land has been bought up often by international corporations for kind of high profile rewilding projects, many of which have turned out not to really be financially viable, but that is a kind of a big question of this kind of idea of land as wilderness that means no people and no farming. So that is kind of, it is a key thing in the context in Scotland. I think in terms of the work that we do as the Land Workers Alliance, because we're working in this context where the government talks about land reform, but it doesn't really mean anything. A lot of the work we've been trying to do has been about shifting, actually changing the narrative about what land reform should look like. So we've been working on running a land justice campaign, and a lot of that is, at this stage, is political education, because only 1.2% of people actually work on the land in Scotland. So most of the people are really quite disconnected. And how do we engage enough people with the land to demand some actually radical change? So running workshops in different local areas, trying to connect people with their local land struggles. Trying to encourage people to have some kind of sense of agency, of entitlement to a connection to land. And organising, we organised a mass protest this summer at a site where an international company has bought a huge amount of land to develop second homes for billionaires. So we organised a protest there, and various kind of different events in different areas to try and build a sort of more radical grassroots movement that's asking for something a bit more meaningful. So that's kind of, I feel like we're quite far behind a lot of other places in the world. We're really, in terms of this stuff. So it's great to learn from everybody else. Oh, I didn't talk about the community right to buy. Do you want me to do that? I think that there is a lot of benefits in the community right to buy. I don't think it's a bad thing, but because of there can be issues because it's about community of place. It's just about people who already live in an area, and which are those communities who can then organise themselves, access the funding, get it together to purchase the land, and which demographics of people those are that can be an issue. It also means that land that you can use for farming, land that you can use for food production is very rarely available to working class urban populations, pretty much not available at all. Most urban communities, can't really wouldn't be able to use the community right to buy to access any land for farming or for food production, except at a really tiny scale. And also a lot of migrant communities are very much centred in urban areas in Scotland too. So there is, this kind of geographical community being the only communities with a right to buy does really limit who has access to that. But I think that one of the biggest issues really is just that all communities are now struggling to afford land because the price of land is too high.
Thank you, Tara. Okay, Carson, so the same, and I'm also adding a couple of points for you, because we've been touching topics like carbon credits, carbon offsetting, so please, how can you relate to these and other international mechanisms coming from the COP, like the RED, which is just based on deforestation of the Global South, extractivism, etc. But also other things like these growth corridors and the resistance to agro and the so-called African Green Revolution, etc., how all this is really affecting possible land reforms or possible bringing back the land to peasant communities in your territory. Yeah, basically that.
Well, well, I will try to answer to the best of the knowledge that I have, especially with the thorny and heavily political terms. I am calling them intentionally terms, such as REDD+. Yeah, so carbon offsetting. I'll start with the carbon offsetting. Yes, thank you. I will start with the carbon offsetting and how it dispossesses of indigenous peoples their power of their land. Let me repeat that. How it dispossesses indigenous peoples power of their land. That actually is against agrarian reforms or land reforms, basically. So I will give you another example. There's a place in Kenya, not these, and then you can Google at your own point. Ask even AI if you have one in your phone. Laikipia, Laikipia. That is a county in Kenya that has like about 10 landowners, largest landowners, owning over 70% of the land. Literally almost what you were saying about 400 people owning huge chunks of land in Scotland. So there's a big problem about the issue of carbon markets, which is the creation of conservancies to offset, carbon emissions and the craze of chasing off the carbon markets and the currency that it is. But for us, this is actually dispossessing us of the power over our land and to be self-reliant in our food systems. I should say this, which is very popular again, that there is no food security if you are not focusing on food sovereignty. So why is it that climate action is being hijacked by globalists and big debates within the UN system, for example? It is still the issue that I mentioned before, which is that governments are pro big landowners for the obvious reason that there is no accountability onto the original landowners or the natives on how the structure of benefits from this land, how are the benefits. So it is veiled as benefiting the entire planet or benefiting the country, but it is again creating food shortage or power over production of your own food. You can link that to what I said before about nutrition-related diseases. Back to the carbon offsetting problem is that we see in Kenya right now, we see excessive campaigns or veiled campaign to convert community lands into conservancies. And I think also the problem is that, not the problem, I have seen that there's a difference between community land here in the global north and maybe no man's land. Where I come from, no man's land doesn't mean community land, and community land doesn't mean no man's land. When you see the land not being used, it doesn't mean that. It is being used by the people. I'll give you a very good example as to why we are against the issue of conservancies or creation of protected areas and the craze of a 30 by 30 within the CBD process. I'll give you a good example that is very practical. I started by saying that I am a pastoralist or agro-pastoralist. So when I was growing up, these things no longer happen. I speak as if I am very old. These things no longer happen because of these problems of conversion of our community land into conservancies. Well, for us, this is age-old wisdom, that's knowledge that has been passed down from our ancestors. My name, Kiburo, is belongs to my ancestor who is 7 generations ahead of me, behind me. And there's knowledge in between. I know all my relatives who are past, or who are on the other side, and all the knowledge within our lineage. Why do I say that? Because as a pastoralist, we do partition our land based on our own biocultural protocols, and knowing that in this season we will be using this part to graze our land as pastures. And then after maybe 3 months, we close that one, we bless it, and open another one. And there are laws on how you can access the one that has been closed, or why not access, and how you cannot access. Then we move to the another one. After seasons, 3 seasons, we come back. 3 to 4 seasons, we come back. We don't have 4 seasons, but we have in between where we switch to the other season. So we come back to the other one, which has regenerated, and there are those which we cannot touch because of medical reasons, medical supplies for the community and for our livestock. Why is it then that these land laws that we have in Kenya, we have almost like four statutes about land only. But the key among them, which is very progressive, is the Community Land Act. But in between, you all know that in all laws or any contract, there's always an exit clause. So there's always a way where the government will always try to find a way inside the management of that community land, which is held in trust by local governments. Local governments like, for example, Oxford City Council. So, but through the community. So the Climate Action Campaign, which is anchored on financing and adaptation, to me, it is, and to many people, I know we are so many who believe in this, that it is a facet to dispossess of indigenous people's land through carbon markets projects. There's no way to put it other than that. And the RED Plus project is another very complicated structure that is commodifying this precious piece that holds together communities, families, and generations after generations. You can easily research about. You don't need to do an academic research to know the structure of RED Plus. That it is about. It is so imperialistic in nature, and that it's with the brokers, with the creation of the whole structure. It's just about dispossession. You mentioned about billionaires owning the land in Scotland. So RED Plus is structured the same way. It's going to come back to haunt us in Global South. So you see, like, we have our own time-tested land practices, as I said, that would always tackle these biodiversity losses, or that would tackle climate action, climate change issues. I could go on and on and on. I really hope I have tried to tackle the political thorny issue of RED Plus and climate change issues together with carbon offsetting. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, how is everyone now? Like, full of information? Perfect, so we still have half an hour, and now it's the time for more interaction, to stretch a little bit if it's necessary. If you need to stand up, do it, and hopefully have a lot of questions for them. So yeah, please, go ahead. Stretch first, yes? I thought those are all hands. Cool. Yes, I think there's one behind.
It's a question, but I don't really know who to address it to. But I suppose Tara. But it's great to hear what's happening in other countries throughout the world, including Scotland. But we are in England, and England and Wales has the largest farms in all of Europe after Czechoslovakia. And that at least land reform is on the agenda in Scotland. It doesn't seem to be on the agenda in England and Wales, but possibly in Wales, but it's very hard to get anybody to think about it. And yet, a lot of these problems are problematic in England, and there's other problems as well to do with the planning issues and so forth. So I'm not sure what my question is, but I would like to hear a bit about what's going on in this country and if other people have some ideas about it, because I've struggled finding decent land at a decent price. I got thrown off, well, several of us got thrown off our tenancy where I've been for 14 years. We pulled our money. We bought some really crap land for extremely high price, covered in ragwort, and we could get it. The only reason we could get it was because it was covered in ragwort and the horsey people wouldn't want it, that sort of thing. We couldn't couldn't find anywhere with barns or outbuildings or anything like that because of Class Q and similar measures that allow existing landowners to sell unwanted agricultural buildings to turn into posh residences. There's dozens of issues like that. And perhaps I should address it to Tara and see if she's got any advice for how we English can follow in the Scottish footsteps.
I can give it a go. I mean, I think the average farm size in Scotland is almost double what it is in England, so it's even we have even bigger farms. But yes, no, I think it's a really good point that it isn't. Yeah, it's not really on the agenda at all politically in an English context. There is a community right to buy coming in England soon, but at the moment that isn't really very focused on land at all. Will tend to look more at kind of like community assets, pubs, shops, that kind of thing. But there is potential that community right to buy could be used for land. So I think there's an area there where we could try and use that as a way to have some degree of reform around land. And the other thing would be planning reform in an English context. Ways that planning reform could be used to help make things easier for people to access, for example, to put up farm buildings, polytunnels, housing on land, so that, because obviously housing becomes one of the biggest issues, not just accessing the land, but actually being able to live where you work. So I would suggest that those are probably the two that I'm aware of, the two kind of angles that it could be approached from a policy perspective. I think that because there isn't this government narrative around land reform, which we have in Scotland, there is maybe quite a lot of grassroots initiatives in England because of that, like the kind of people working on land matching service, which is very much coming from the grassroots, or things like the ecological land cooperative, and there's like different approaches that people have kind of had to use because there is no government narrative, whereas in the Scottish context the government have kind of had control over that story. Up until recently, I think that's really shifting. There's a huge amount of people are really interested in kind of reclaiming that now. But that's kind of shifting. But someone here who's actually lives and works in England might have something else to add to that.
Part of the land justice movement, which is just a really nascent movement of movements, and I think the feeling amongst people is that there needs to be kind of solidarity, alliances and bridge building between people who are struggling because of privatization of land and land inequality across housing, across farming, looking at abolition, racialized inequalities, etc., etc. So it's like there's been a real we're not ready to push for certain policies yet because we need to build relationships, trust and alliances within these different sectors first. So that's at least in the land justice movement. Maybe Bonnie wants to talk about the people's land policy, or not.
I think people are trying. I live in London, and involved in something called the People's Land Policy Collective, and we put together a manifesto for land justice that's arguing for things. We believe very strongly that it has to come from the grassroots and a grassroots movement. And I suppose that's what all these different groups are trying to do. We find particularly that we need to bring people together from all land-related struggles. So, for example, food is one of them, but also housing is an issue, community spaces is an issue, green spaces is an issue. All these are issues to do with land, that we don't have land, we don't have access to it, we don't have control over it. And oddly enough, we're trying to do stuff in London, and that's trying to bring together growers, housing activists, and different campaigners. And for example, last summer we had a land justice fair, and that was in a community-run park in South London. And we had different groups there, people who had never worked together before, you know, people who were all involved in food growing but had never talked to housing campaigners. And also people who are fighting to protect certain assets like local markets. And also we had a group from Friends of Windrush Square. They're trying to take over a square in Brixton and try to turn it into a kind of legacy for the Windrush generation. So in other words, land justice has to bring together more than just food people, and it has to be all these grassroots groups coming together. And it's only then, I think someone said in our last session, at least that Olivia said, that no government's going to give you stuff, that you're only going to get it by creating a mass movement. And that is what we're trying to work for and trying to bring people together in a number of fronts.
So yeah, question for all of you, because I couldn't help but compare and contrast what I was hearing across the different contexts. And on the one hand, I could hear private land ownership, historic, particularly private land ownership is causing problems. Governments are kicking people off land and bringing in investors like in Kenya and in Sri Lanka and cutting off people from their resources. So I was like, well, who is better to own the land? Like, I'm hearing government bad, private land owners is bad. I really root for this cause, but I'm like, where is it going? Like, what are we asking for? Who is the people?
Very good question. I think it's a great question. Who feels confident to answer this question? Anyone?
So the question is who is the people? Yeah, as it is obviously it's very political. And I like what you've said, that no government will give you anything. You just ask. We need a movement. And there are so many movements world over on fighting for the people. So who is the people? I will begin by telling you something about the law in Kenya. So Article 1 of the Constitution of Kenya says, talks about who is the people by saying that the people are sovereign and that they have conferred that sovereign power to the three arms of government. The judiciary, obviously, the parliament first, maybe, and judiciary and the executive. And so who is government? It is the people. Unfortunately, politics just creates a web of lies, deception, and all that inside government, so that the people who have sovereign power do not exercise that power. For example, if the people says that we need agrarian reforms, a very simple statement like that we need redistribution of the land from the way it is, we don't like it. So that is the people saying that we want the change inside the government, the policies to change. So the people are the citizens, actually, as you may know, obviously. I don't know why I'm teaching you. I'm just saying that the power, the reason why we speak for the people is that we speak based on the conviction that we feel that the laws of the land, the laws of the hub, based on our territory, different territories that we come from, do not favor the current challenges that we have. So it means that the people want the change. I have just tried something easy.
It's same. Yeah, I think it's, I don't want to say again. I also agree because we have experience. I think it's like in the Lavia Campesina, we also thinking how we practice the power, because that's why we're thinking we need to practice the power, how we change the governments as a, what, he said, it's like who build the power? What is the government doing? It's us. We cannot silent. That's why we need to practice our power as a people. We are the voters. We select them. We're not outsiders. We are the responsible people who, why government doing this one, that one. We need to work with the government as us, as Sri Lankan, I like to say, because 2021, we believe it's like last 70 years, we have one regime who government doing what they want. And we feel we need to change. We occupied the presidential house, we changed the power. Now with the new government, with the new people's government, we also fighting with the bring new policies. It's happening. It's like I think it's like a Colombia also. They're trying to push like 60 years. They have armed struggles. Now they have a new government. It's not easy to with the geopolitical situation, because in the Sri Lanka we are facing now, India trying to control us, China have their own politics to the Sri Lankan territory, and US, it's happening. Global North, it's not only the global North or South, but it's everywhere. We need to access to power with our sense. We are the voters. We are the responsible people, these all governments. We cannot say it's some governments doing these things. We are the responsible people to giving power to them to oppress us. We need to understand that. We don't want them to oppress us. We need to say it's not your work, because we really need to practice our power. That's why we think we need to giving awareness to the people. It's like it's not an education system. It's like we really need to understand the political education to the people. That's why Lavia very closely work with the political formation to our community. Because in my sense, in the Asian sense, we think all happening with the gods. I think it's Europe also. It's not true. It's not true. We need to practice our politics in our sense. We need to work with how we tackle with the politics and how we work on it. It's not a government, it's us. It's our responsibility to work with the reality. Thank you.
Oh, yes. I got reminded there's some online questions. I'm going to read them. Thank you. No, not yet. No. So I think there's more questions in the room. Yes. Thank you. You can check. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Kind of following, sorry, just dropped my phone. On the previous question, I was going to ask about public ownership of land. I'm also based in Scotland, where public land ownership is important, but private ownership is dominant. And I work for a body that sort of pushes for public sector leadership. But I hear, if I understand correctly, both in Sri Lanka and in Kenya, there are like structures in place that mean that there is like a focus in some ways on public sector ownership, be that by local authorities holding land for the community, be that by the state organizations that you were mentioning. So I just was wondering if you could say just a bit more about those structures and the actual experience in how they have helped and maybe have held back some of the people power.
Yeah. So maybe we can wait, or? Okay. The structure within, so in Kenya, the most progressive law, which is very positive in all senses, the Community Land Act, which was passed in 2016. It's 8 years ago, but the progress has been painstakingly slow to make it a reality, and even to see to get hold of the lowest hanging fruits of what was expected from that piece of law. Having said that, is that the most important thing that we see from that law is that, as it is known as Community Land Act, is that a community, for example, a community of, let me give an example, which has, we have three success stories. There are people known as Ogiek people, and then there is, I think it's Sengweru people. They are forest peoples, and they are hunters and gatherers. So they did apply. So the structure is, let me start with the structure. So the structure of the law is that, this piece of law is that there is a land registrar, but then this law gave power to a registrar for community land. So there's a community land registrar. So a whole department that only deals with the community land. So with the registrar is you apply as a community that you want to register your community land. So probably, so there are many ways. There are free-range landowners, there are private owners, or one which was held in trust on behalf of the people. Again, the people, on behalf of the people, by, say, for example, a municipal government. Or in Kenya they call county governments, which is a local form of governance. Where so what happens is that you apply from those three or four ways, where you collapse all those other forms of ownerships, and then you apply to get a certificate of ownership or the title of the community. But who owns this land? So the trusteeship from the local government structure, which is the county government, who owns in trust on behalf of that community, will now transfer the ownership to the new committee that you will have created as a community. So if at any given time you will want to convert your land from, you want to pick your piece of land that belonged to you inside the Community Land Act, there's another process of doing that. But then again, the title will have been held as one. It's one title on behalf of the community. So we are also trying to do that as a tribe, so that we move away from, because let me give the problem. The problem is that county governments, which is a government actually, it's so easy to take away that land which is holding in trust on behalf of the people and do anything they want, because it's essentially a public land. So we are trying to do that so that we can be able to go back to our ancient grazing style and conserve and regenerate and live with nature the way we have always been. So I don't know if I gave some context and the structure of it. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I like to explain the Sri Lankan contest. In the 1972, we have a kind of a land reform program in Sri Lanka. It's like giving the land for the people. It's like a very limited area to for living, like a half acre. I don't know, it's understand, for the agriculture purpose, like a 1 hectare. That is the dividing for the land. And also we cannot sell out. It's under it's like a lease for the government. It's a 99 lease for the government. Everyone get the piece of land to work as agriculture purpose. It's like it's objective, maximize the agriculture product. That's the idea of the agrarian reform. It's for the agriculture purpose. And also the fishing and the indigenous people, they have a kind of different type of the agrarian kind of land distribution. Kind of like indigenous people, they have access to the own territory as a forest. They have a kind of community, it's like under the government. They can access to the forest and their own territories. Kind of how to say, like sacred land for their belongs. That's also happening in Sri Lanka. And also the fishing, they have a special way to access to the sea and also the coastal area and the small harbors. That's still there, but in the new way, they're trying to change some point because it's the we cannot sell out our lands because it's under the government. It's just we can lease, like a 99-year lease. We have a small document, but it's not. We can go to the bank to ask the like a loans. We cannot do that. It's under the government. And the same way, we have a different kind of land policies. Like a north and east, they have their own land policies, and the Agrarian Reform, we have a Land Ordinary Act and the Agrarian Reform Act, and also the Secret Land Act. It's kind of different land acts we are belongs, and that's why it's like a lot of foreign investors cannot access to the Sri Lankan lands because of that. That's why the new conditions coming with the IMF, they are promoting private ownership of the land. They're saying it's good to, you can sell, you can go to the bank, you can get, because in the one place, they cannot access to the land because of we have a private ceiling in the 1975, we have only 100 acres as a private ownership can have as a land. That's why still we are safe as a sense of the agrarian reform. And it's not only the agrarian purpose, it's totally depend with the housing and the living purpose, because as a new demands, because of the, I said, we have in the tree plantation, it's under the government, but we have a huge problem with the workers who coming with the British time, Indian descendants. As our movement, we demanded the land distribution for them. We are asking for the 20 purchase for the living and 2 acres for the their income generation as a tea plantation or whatever they want. That's our demand. Nowadays, we are getting for the living purpose with the new government. We have a kind of progressive work with the giving a small land for the living. But still, we are thinking how we distribute the land for the production. That's our new work with the new government. Because it's new government's like a 5 months, less than that, yeah. We are doing that, but still we are against to the kind of private ownership. We know it's so worst. We have a kind of bad experience because in the new way, they're trying to promote contract farming through because they don't want to get our lands. We become our workers in our own land. That's happening with the banana production, kind of production, new way of the work. It's happening in Sri Lanka, but we are against that. Still, we kind of safe with that process, yeah.
So we have 10 minutes left, no, 7 minutes left. Now, I would like to see how many other questions we want to have. See 1 there, 2 there. Anyone else? The last curious question? 3 there. Okay, so then I will ask brief questions, brief answers, so we have space for all of them. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. The question I want to ask quickly is on land personhood. I know it's something that has been done in a few places. India has given personhood to the Ganges River to try and give it more legal protection from pollution. Other initiatives have been done in places like New Zealand. It's an option to try and bind the land closer to the community, as well as give it more protection from corporations trying to take it from people. And I was interested if it's a option for land reform that might add a new avenue for protecting land and reforming how land can be used away from detrimental uses. Thank you.
Can you repeat the concept land? Because
personhood. It's
personhood.
Something that a few countries have tried to give legal personhood to pieces of land, such as rivers or mountains and the like.
This is something that has come up in some of the discussions we've been having in Scotland, whether this is a useful way of approaching land reform. I was initially not that convinced because I don't find the kind of rights-based approach that useful. Sure, the Ganges River might have rights, but humans' rights are not respected. Having rights just because we officially legally have rights doesn't actually have that much impact on our lives. So I don't necessarily think that it's that useful as a rights-based approach, but I have heard it argued that it's a good way of taking land completely out of the ownership structure entirely, and that I think is for me that's a much more convincing argument. If land it is a kind of legal person and cannot be owned, then it can't be, sold by the government to private interest when the government shifts, So I think that from that perspective, that there is some potential in it as a way of removing land from the market.
Next question. I think there was a question over there. Thank you.
Hello. I just had a question with regards to the role that the international sphere plays in your work. So both in terms of La Via Campesina being international and you being from 3 different countries. But how that help, or if and how it helps you in your work in terms of putting pressure on international bodies or on governments if it does that, or also just in terms of knowledge sharing, what's happening in this room today in terms of tactics, I guess. I'll just keep it to that. Yes.
Yeah, you can.
Me? I can answer, okay. So I think that there's pros and contradictions. There's plenty of pros, basically because we can support each other from different successful stories, from different wins in that regards. Of course, then we realize sometimes when we were preparing today the session that in some territories we use the concept of land reform, other territories use the concept of agrarian reform. So we need to understand the differences also. But then in terms of international bodies, something very interesting, how we start today and how we're ending, it's the ICARRD, never know how to pronounce it. International conference like this one that happens 20 years in Brazil and it's going to happen in January in Colombia are super important. Just so you know, when the UNDROP was approved, the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Peasants, they were constantly referring to ICARRD as a right of people to have land, as a right of people to farm in their land, and the right of those people who live in the land to farm and to actually own the land, collectively or privately. So these international bodies or this international conference are extremely important because otherwise there's no international protection. And of course then you go to local or national laws and it changes completely. But I think that's one of the challenges of Via Campesina, to support each other, support every community and every continent and region where we are, but also to understand that there's a huge differences. With Anuka, we were in Colombia not last October, but the other year, and we see how when we talk about workers' rights, the differences depending if we're talking about colonized countries or countries within colonized. And this is a big challenge for us, and also it's a big challenge sometimes when we talk about big statement in solidarity with certain regions in the world, because then there's a lot of geopolitics enter into here. But if we stay in the positive side, I think it's really important to put pressure at international level, at the UN level as well. We had,
Quickly, I can add something also. There's always power in unity, and so in solidarity. So being in conferences like this one we are constantly and persistently building pieces of soft law, which also adds up as layers of international law. So, for example, I do know that due to so many years of hard work and campaigning and also negotiations at CFS and at the UN level headquarters, we have my friends at La Via Campesina and others have pushed, and that we now have United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Persons. Also, within the indigenous peoples sphere, so many conferences and discussions and negotiations have led to very powerful pieces of law, soft law, international law, such as United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also comments within ICARRD. These are UN treaty bodies, building up towards upholding the rights of the people, again, for example, within the UN human rights space. And so there's a lot of gains when we talk together, when we share these ideas and we put down and make sure that these negotiations uphold the rights of the people. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to stop. There was one more question, but I encourage you to come here. We can have a discussion now because we need to finish. So thanks a lot, the three of you, really inspiring. Hope we can continue, and thanks a lot for attending.
you.